During this week on digital identity, Dr. Braden Allenby has been hosting the 2012 Chautauqua Council entitled Implications of Emerging Military Security Technologies for the Laws of War. This council is a collaboration among the Lincoln Center for Applied Ethics at Arizona State University and Chautauqua Institution and the Consortium for Emerging Technologies, Military Operations, and National Security. Specifically, this meeting explored the questions of whether the laws of war and related legal, ethical, and governmental mechanisms have been rendered obsolete in whole or in part of emerging military security technologies. The goal of the meetings this week was to generate information and analysis that will support intelligent and coherent public dialogue and enable rational policy development and deployment. We have with us today some members of this year's Chautauqua Council, organized by Dr. Brad Allenby. This panel is here this morning to present a report from their meetings and to hear feedback from you all. I will introduce Dr. Allenby, and he will introduce the subject and the panelists. Dr. Brad Allenby had a busy week with us this week. He was the 1045.
We know, we're working on the outside speakers.
Okay. Until the outside speakers are on, you can move in just a little bit, and then when they're on, you can move out. There's plenty of room under the roof right now. Dr. Allenby had a busy week with us. He was 1045 Wednesday morning speaker, followed by a book signing and a question and answer session at the Women's Club. And some of you heard him and think he's wonderful, as do we. He will stay with us next week for our annual Lincoln Applied Ethics program. He is the current Lincoln Professor of Engineering and Ethics and a Professor of Civil, Environmental, and Sustainable Engineering, and also of Law at Arizona State University, where he is also the founding chair of the Consortium for Emerging Technology, Military Operations, and National Security. Ladies and gentlemen, veterans and pacifists, digital natives and immigrants, please extend a warm Chautauqua welcome to these esteemed scholars.
Thank you very much, Shara, and I'd like to also thank David Lincoln, who has supported our activities and has supported this council. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a very brief overview of the subject matter, and then I'm going to ask members of the council, individual members who participated this week, to give you their impressions, their ideas in this domain. A couple of caveats. The first is that their comments, and I have asked them to speak personally, and they are not speaking institutionally. Their comments do not reflect the positions of their organizations. That's very important for some of the organizations that we want to involve in this activity. The second thing is that the discussions have been very broad-ranging, and our effort was to try to explore the space, the domain, the intellectual terrain, not to achieve consensus. So you may hear speakers contradict each other. That is, I think, a sign of two things. One, of strength, and secondly, of the fact that a lot of these issues are very real and are just beginning to be addressed. It would be premature both to expect agreement and to demand it, because you might close before you had enough information to know what you were really talking about. In order to help you think about this as we think about it, we have handed out a set of questions. Some of you may not have gotten that, and for people who may be watching this or listening to this, I'll read them without answering them, because what we want you to do is to think about them as you hear us and as you formulate your own ideas on these issues. Number one, if we have rules of warfare and of conflict, why can't we just make a rule that says no war? Isn't the best law of war simply not to have them? Number 2, assuming that war is an inherently human endeavor, do wars need to be, quote unquote, fair? Isn't, quote, just war, unquote, an oxymoron? Number 3, does modern technology make the use of force too tempting an option for world leaders? Number 4, if it is the horror of war that makes us avoid it, why should we attempt to make it less horrible? Quote, an ethical war is a short one, so use the most violence, unquote. That has, by the way, been the position of a group of military scholars over many, many centuries. So it's not a merely hypothetical question. Number 5, has increasing reliance on new military technologies helped to insulate the public from the consequences of war? So think of those and how you would respond to them as you listen to us. The process we're going to follow is that I'm going to give you a brief overview of the terrain to the point of being grossly oversimplistic, which is an area that I tend to operate pretty well in. And then we're going to have a speaker who has deep legal experience because he works for, I don't know, do you want me to introduce your organization? Yeah, International Committee for the Red Cross. He's one of their leading legal experts in this area who's going to give you a little bit more content. And then we will walk through the participants that wanted to provide you with their perspectives. And they will be different, and at the end, we're hoping to take a very short period of time with this. We're going to open it up for questions. The questioners will as always in this venue, line up at the microphones, and we will go back and forth as we have time. And we will, whoever is best suited on the panel to respond to your question will respond to your question. To the speakers, you have 4 minutes each. I will be brutal in stopping you after 4 minutes. To the audience, I will probably appear to be grossly impolite. If I'm not, these guys will talk forever. All right. I'm going to just be very, very brief. There are 3 basic approaches to the whole question of human conflict. The first one is pacifist. Just don't do it. It has always, particularly in the last century or two, had a significant representation. There's all kinds of gradations, but the basic position is don't do it. Question number 1, isn't the best rule not to have war? The opposite of pacifist is sort of the realist position. The realist position is states have no moral responsibility to anything but their own interests, and anything they do in protecting that interest is appropriate. Think perhaps Henry Kissinger or France distilled. Nobody is an absolute realist. Nobody is an absolute pacifist in actual international negotiations and activities, but those are important stakes in the ground. You cannot disprove the validity of either one of those positions. What we're interested in, though, is the space where almost all international activity exists, where the UN exists, where the Security Council exists, where the Geneva Conventions exist, and that is that third middle position which says, as long as we're going to have wars, and we have no evidence that we've been able to stop them, we want to have wars that minimize the damage, particularly to innocent parties. And that's where the laws of war, the laws of armed conflict, international humanitarian law, that's where this lives. Now, to give you an idea of some of the perspectives on this, this is a recent science. It's about the scientific basis for human conflict. That's becoming a more active area of research. It's not an area people have looked at very much in the past. So that's one perspective that comes into this. Second perspective, and a very important perspective. This is a document called Unrestricted Warfare by Yang and Yang Zhu, I'm sure I butchered those, who are two analysts. One is a high officer in the PLA, China's People's Liberation Army. It's a very, very competent, very, very well-written analysis of what warfare may look like in the 21st century. For those of you that tend to think of China as puerile or as not having a very sophisticated understanding of the world that they're operating in, this is a good document for you to read. It's also important because it suggests some of their perspectives. This is the Law of War Desk Book from the JAG School at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. This is the kind of document we're talking about as representing that third middle position. Lest you think that that is a foolish position, either because you're a pacifist or a realist, this is where virtually all of the world's activity in terms of conflict lives. It's a very, very deep and well-developed corpus of law. That's what we were talking about. I won't take any more time. And I will ask the presenters, by the way, introduce yourselves to the audience as you want them to be understanding you, given your comments. That should avoid some of the issues we talked about. All right, George.